The metallic roar spread through the hangar like a whisper of impending disaster. The new propulsion engine, designed to power the most ambitious rocket of the last decade, simply wasn't working. With each attempt, the structure vibrated incorrectly, deviated from the pattern, and emitted a sound that confused the sensors, like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Screens lit up, alarms flashed orange, engineers huddled around tablets, formulas, simulations. No one knew where the fault lay. Time, however, was the cruelest enemy. Exactly 3 days remained until the ignition test, and any delay would jeopardize the entire mission. The damage would be incalculable, and the weight of failure would fall on the shoulders of an entire generation of scientists who had staked their careers on that engine. Inside the control room, the atmosphere was one of Cold War. Words were whispered, glances searching for someone to blame. Many were already thinking about activating the contingency plan, replacing the system. But that meant starting over. It would take months. A thick silence fell among the project veterans until, in the corner of the room, one of the older technicians took off his glasses, ran his hand over his face and murmured, "There's this guy, but it's been a long time." No one paid much attention. "Alvin Cole," he repeated more firmly. He helped create the first naval stabilization systems. "If anyone can hear what we can't hear, it's him." The name dropped like a stone into a still pond. Most of those present didn't even know who he was. Others, the older ones, looked at each other, some skeptically, some embarrassed. Alvin Cole, a ghost from the past, a forgotten man. Have you ever felt left out? Have you ever had a truth swallowed by the silence of others? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover now may change the way you view the value of experience and the weight of injustice. Alvin hadn't set foot on a federal installation since the late 1980s. At the time, he was considered one of the Navy's foremost marine propulsion experts, a technical genius, but soft-spoken. It was precisely because he spoke so little that he became an easy target. A technical error during the installation of an auxiliary system resulted in the failure of one of the engines on a military ship. There was an incident. No one died, but the impact was severe enough for a culprit to be sought. Alvin tried to explain, warning that he had identified a misalignment, but his reports disappeared, and so did his voice. The technical tribunal deemed him reckless. He was dismissed, humiliated. He never returned to service. Since then, he lived in isolation near Cape Canaveral, working with old boat engines, rebuilding obsolete parts, as if searching in every screw for the justice he had been denied. He had no social media, gave no interviews, and posted on no forums. For all intents and purposes, he was just another eccentric old man stuck in time. But to those who truly knew his story, Alvin was more than that. He was a living library of mechanical precision. Someone capable of identifying a flaw by its sound, like a conductor hearing a single out-of-tune instrument in a steel orchestra. When the official invitation from NASA arrived, Alvin didn't even ask for details. He simply dusted off his industrial stethoscope, put on the worn-out shirt he always wore in the Navy workshops, and caught the morning bus to Kennedy Space Center. There was no speech, no anxiety. Just the weight of an unresolved past, and a mission that for him was more personal than anyone there could have imagined. As he descended to the main entrance, many couldn't hide their judgmental looks. A security guard even asked if he was in the right place. The younger engineers whispered, chuckling. "Are you serious?" one of them muttered. "NASA called a grandfather to sort this out." Alvin walked straight past, silent. The stethoscope hanging around his neck swung gently. And when he entered the main hangar and saw the engine standing imposingly, still warm from recent testing, he simply closed his eyes for a second and listened. He listened like someone hearing a familiar voice in the crowd. This wasn't just a machine. It was a call. But no one there yet knew that Alvin wasn't just here to fix an engine. He'd come back to face a ghost. And what he'd discover as he approached the structure, with his calloused fingers and trained ears, could change everything. And that's exactly where the real story begins. He was sitting on a worn wooden bench, silently sanding a valve part that was no longer useful, when he heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. It wasn't common for anyone to come here, much less someone in a suit. The NASA director, accompanied by a young assistant, stood before the workshop without saying a word for almost a minute. Alvin didn't even look up. He continued the slow motion of the sandpaper, as if he knew exactly why he was there. The man next to the director looked around, uncomfortable with the smell of grease, the pile of disassembled engines, the sheer number of things that seemed to have been there for decades. And they had. That workshop wasn't just where Alvin fixed parts, it was where he kept himself standing. Inside were memories in the shape of gears, ghosts in the shape of screws. When he finally looked up, Alvin didn't ask the reason for his visit. He didn't offer a chair, coffee, or conversation. He simply wiped the sweat from his forehead with an old rag, and with the same calm with which he used to adjust the naval fleet's cooling system, said, "You guys took your time." He knew, and so did they. The director hesitated, not out of pride, but out of guilt. He had read Alvin's case report a few years ago, out of curiosity, then out of indignation. He knew the man had been used as a scapegoat. He knew there was no clear evidence that he was at fault. He knew Alvin had warned in time, and had been ignored. But it was too late. The system had already done what it always does to those who speak softly. Crushed them. Alvin picked up the stethoscope, an old object so deeply scarred it seemed to have heard all the pain he couldn't even voice. He ran his finger over the metal, folded the cloth with the naval design, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. There was no negotiation, no request, just a look of bitter acceptance. It was as if to say, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I need to finish what you started in me." The drive to the Space Center was made in silence. Alvin, staring out the car window, watched the Florida landscapes pass by like an old movie, the same one that played every night inside his head when his eyes closed, but the past wouldn't let up. He remembered the last time he'd been near there. He remembered the screams, the sound of the explosion, the disappointed look of a commander who had once treated him like a son and then treated him like a traitor. He remembered the technical tribunal, the cold words, the short headlines. Navy engineer dismissed for serious misconduct, and no one wanted to hear the rest. Upon arriving at the main hangar, the looks on their faces were almost unanimous, disbelief. One of the younger engineers turned to the other and whispered, "This is the guy who came to save the rocket. He looks more like a retired janitor." Alvin listened. He didn't react. This was an old acquaintance, older than his tools. He walked to the engine without taking his eyes off it. He placed his stethoscope on the metal, slowly bent down, and leaned his head to the side as if listening to an old ailing friend trying to tell him where it hurt. For 30 seconds, no one moved. Alvin stood still, eyes closed, his fingers resting lightly on the metal frame as if on a chest about to stop beating. And then, without a word, he stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and walked out of the hangar as if leaving an invisible message in the air. Later, in a closed environment, one of the technicians confronted him. "So what's up? Do you have any idea what might be going on? Because here we use spectral analysis, harmonic resonance, and real-time thermal monitoring, and nothing. Are you going to use a piece of iron with a headset to solve something that even our artificial intelligence couldn't solve?" Alvin looked at him seriously. He took a deep breath and said, "You hear machines? I hear voices." The room laughed. But the director didn't. That night, Alvin was alone with the project schematics, system maps, and failure reports. Instead of using computers, he scribbled by hand. He reread the technical descriptions like someone reading an old letter, searching between the lines for what no one had written. And it was there, as he compared an old naval propulsion model with the new space engine design, that something clicked. It wasn't a calculation. It wasn't a formula. It was a sound he knew. Flashback. USS Fairmont. Silent night. The sound of the engine slightly out of tune. Alvin, younger, leaning on his stethoscope and saying to the sergeant, "Something's wrong. It's pulling too much torque to the left." The sergeant laughs, says he's paranoid, that the sensors aren't showing anything. Hours later, the system collapses. People are injured. Investigation. And Alvin, who had tried to warn, is accused of neglecting maintenance. Back in the present, Alvin trembles slightly as he runs his finger over the spot on the project where the sounds seem to reside. A tiny misalignment, invisible to the naked eye, imperceptible to machines, but audible to anyone who knew how to listen. The pain in my chest returned. It wasn't physical, it was the weight of a truth ignored for too long. And now it was there, again. And it's precisely at this point that the story begins to shift in tone. Because when the pain is old, the right thing to do needs to be old too. And Alvin was about to do something no one in that place would ever forget. Right there. Some truths don't make noise. He walked to the engine as if returning to the scene of an accident. The smooth, gleaming floor of the hangar contrasted with the weight of his steps. All around him was cutting-edge technology, digital panels, voice commands, state-of-the-art sensors, but none of it seemed to intimidate him. Alvin had something no other machine there possessed, a living memory. He didn't look at the engine as a project to be deciphered, but as a living body trying to cry out for help in any way it could, and that's how he knelt, in silence. No speeches, no resume presentation. He simply placed the cold stethoscope against the warm frame and closed his eyes. Behind him, the chatter spread with gusto. "That guy's going to sleep listening to the rocket breathing," one of the young engineers quipped. "NASA's really gone crazy. Looks like they pulled the old guy out of the junkyard thinking he was a rare piece," another scoffed. Alvin didn't turn around. This wasn't new. He'd learned to live with the laughter of those who'd never heard the sound of technical silence. He asked for only one thing, absolute silence. And when the engine started, the sound that spread through the hangar was no different than usual, except to him. While everyone else continued to stare at monitors, waiting for graphs, he heard the vibration as if it were being transmitted straight to his chest. It was 30 seconds. And then another 30. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. No one understood, or if they did, they pretended not to see. Alvin slowly pulled away, carefully removed his stethoscope, and wiped it clean as if he'd just heard the final confession of a dying friend. There was a slight tremor in his left hand. An old signal, one that only appeared when very specific memories returned. He knew that sound, the same kind of oscillation he'd heard that early morning aboard the USS Fairmont just before the failure. A kind of noise no machine could pick up because it wasn't exactly an error, it was a consequence. Something that started too small for algorithms to detect, but that, if ignored, grew until it consumed everything. And in that moment, inside that cold hangar filled with skeptical eyes, Alvin found himself back on the ship's deck. He saw the lieutenant screaming, the alarms blaring, the red light flashing on the metal ceiling. He saw the injured sailor trapped under the fallen panel, and he saw himself standing there shouting, "I told you so." But no one listened, because back then listening to a grizzled engineer wasn't a priority. They needed someone to blame, not a warning. When he returned to reality, Alvin already knew. The sound he had just identified wasn't just a technical clue, it was a reopened wound, a flaw that now resurfaced, not as a mistake, but as a second chance. But he hesitated, because understanding the problem was one thing. Having the courage to say it out loud was another. The fear of being discredited again, the fear of, once again, being labeled as the old man who insists on talking about a world that no longer exists. He walked to a nearby workbench, grabbed paper and pencil, and began scribbling by hand what most people would do in software. Squiggly lines, quick notes, incomplete formulas. It was as if he were in a trance. And perhaps he was. Because with each line he drew, he also revisited a page of his own life, the smiles of the past, the first time he entered a control room, the feeling of having been useful. And the exact moment all of this was ripped away from him, with a stamp of guilt and institutional silence. Hours passed. The hangar was now emptier. The younger members had gone to dinner, and only a few senior figures remained observing. The director approached slowly, trying to understand what Alvin was looking for in that sea of scribbles, and it was there that he heard, for the first time, Alvin say something that wasn't a technical request. "This engine is crying for help. But you're not listening. You're just measuring. Listen with me." The director leaned in but couldn't hear anything beyond the usual. It was frustrating, but also disconcerting, because there was something in the firmness of Alvin's voice that didn't sound like guesswork. It sounded like someone who'd lived long enough to no longer have time to lie to himself. And that's when Alvin revealed it. The problem wasn't in the ignition system, as they'd thought, nor in the stability sensors. It was in a spot so specific, so ridiculously small, that any average technician would say it wouldn't make a difference, but it did. Because when you're working with propulsion, every millimeter matters. There's a misalignment in the torque pin housing, less than half a millimeter. But this generates a harmonic vibration that the system doesn't recognize as an error. It just senses something's wrong and tries to compensate on its own until it fails completely. The director swallowed hard. He asked for the engineers to be called back, but Alvin interrupted. "Before that, I need to show you something." He pulled a small metal box from his pocket, rusty, ancient. Opening it revealed a broken piece. It was from the USS Fairmont. The same piece he'd tried to warn about years ago. He'd kept it as a souvenir, or perhaps as a materialized scar. All records of that failure had been erased from official records, but he kept the piece. Because the pain of being forgotten is only less than the pain of forgetting who you were. And now that same vibration reappeared years later in a completely different context. It was as if the past had returned to ask him to close a cycle, not with applause, but with precision. The director asked the team to make the suggested adjustments. Many hesitated, others objected. "What if he's wrong?" one asked. "Are we going to dismantle half a system based on a hunch?" Alvin didn't answer. He simply left the box on the counter and walked away. Behind him, silence fell again, but this time it was a curious silence, charged, almost reverent. And as he walked back through the hangar, head held high, eyes fixed nowhere, a certainty grew within him. Some failures aren't technical, they're human. And some eavesdropping doesn't come from the ears, but from the conscience. There are stories that only make sense when we stop trying to fix what we didn't hear. Write in the comments, there are things that only time can fix. He kept his eyes closed for a moment longer than necessary. It was as if he were trying to convince his own heart to keep beating in time with the engine in front of him. Alvin knew what he had heard, that almost imperceptible vibration hidden in the metallic innards of the system was the same imbalance he had tried to report 39 years earlier, and that no one would hear. That day on the deck of the USS Fairmont, he had felt that same unease in the air, a subtle, out-of-place hum, like a wrong note in a symphony. He alerted his superiors, insisted, presented schemes, suggested a preventive shutdown, but he was ignored. He was too young to confront the hierarchy, too old to be considered just an apprentice. He was squeezed in the middle, invisible. And when everything went wrong, when the engine stalled in the middle of the sea and a young sailor was trapped under a failed plate, only his name appeared in the reports. The pain Alvin felt now wasn't just physical, it was the pain of doubt. What if he had truly made a mistake back then? What if this current vibration was just a cruel coincidence, an echo of the trauma? His reputation, already nearly erased, could be destroyed forever. But there was something more at stake here. It was a fight for dignity, for something no machine could measure. Kneeling, his weather-beaten knees pressing into the hard hangar floor, Alvin wasn't just a Navy veteran, he was a man facing the final judgment of his own conscience. He took a deep breath, opened his eyes and stood still, silent. The team around him seemed indifferent to the battle raging within him. One of the engineers laughed again. Either he fell asleep there or he's waiting for the engine to confess the defect on its own. Alvin didn't answer, but his clenched hand trembled. Inside it, he held the same small notebook he'd carried since the 1980s. In it were recorded all the faults he'd diagnosed throughout his life, including the one that doomed him. Outside, the Florida sky was beginning to darken, but inside, an even bigger storm was brewing. He struggled to his feet, unaided, and walked slowly to the bench where the project lay open. His hands glided over the diagrams like someone reading a letter left by someone who never returned. He marked the exact spot where he believed the misalignment to be, a torque bracket positioned 0.4 millimeters outside the ideal tolerance, ridiculously small to most, noticeable only to those with decades of listening. As he presented his hypothesis to the technical group, Alvin was interrupted before he could finish his sentence. "That doesn't make sense, sir. That margin is within the acceptable range, and if we mess with it, we could throw off the balance of the rest of the system." The tone was polite, but filled with contempt disguised as logic. Alvin tried to argue, to explain the sound pattern, the cascading consequences. But the more he spoke, the more distant he felt. It was like reliving the military technical tribunal, where everything he said seemed to register as noise. The scene repeated itself, the judgmental eyes, the restrained smiles, the weight of disbelief. But there was a difference now. He was no longer in a position to ask permission. He was there by choice, and there was a decision to make. He could remain silent again, preserve the little peace he had built in exile, or he could insist, even if it cost him everything again. That's when the project director, who had been watching silently until then, asked everyone to leave the room for a few minutes. It was just him and Alvin. There were no more monitors, no machinery noise, just the sound of the air conditioning and their heavy breathing. The director sat down across from Alvin and said something no one had ever said to him so clearly. "Show me. I want to understand what you're hearing." It wasn't an order. It was a sincere request. And it broke something inside him. Alvin pulled up the chair next to him and began explaining how a vibration like this manifested itself not in the sensors, but in the subsequent mechanical responses. He drew, simulated with old metal parts, showed the rusted ship part, still preserved like a physical wound, and described the sound he heard on both occasions, the measure, the rhythm, the frequency. The director listened to him without interrupting. For the first time in almost 40 years, Alvin spoke and was heard. It was decided right there between the two of them that they would make the correction. Not officially. It would be just a spot adjustment, silent, without recording it in the system. If it worked, great. If not, no one would need to know. But for Alvin, this was more than an attempt. It was a silent repair. Dawn arrived without them noticing. The part was removed, adjusted by hand, and reinstalled. And the engine restarted. There was tension in the air. Alvin didn't watch closely. He sat at the back of the hangar, hands clasped, eyes on the ground. But when the engine revved, something changed. The sound that had previously vibrated like a dissonant drum was now smooth, clean and precise, like a steady heartbeat after a fright. The technical team didn't know what to say. The director, still silent, stared at the monitors. No one dared celebrate, not because they doubted, but because they were facing something logic couldn't explain. A 79-year-old veteran had just solved a problem no technology could map, but Alvin didn't smile or celebrate. He simply closed his notebook, put it in his pocket, and walked toward the hangar exit. It wasn't time to celebrate yet, because even though the engine had come back to life, there was another piece inside that still needed repair, his own identity. He didn't want medals or headlines. He just wanted back what should never have been taken away, the right to be heard. And this was just beginning. Write it down. Truth makes no noise, but it remains. The tools were positioned on the bench like scalpels before emergency surgery. Every technician involved in the operation knew the risk. Tampering there, where the machine said everything was fine, was like opening a healthy patient's chest, based solely on the instincts of an old man who didn't use a tablet, didn't read graphs, or trust AI. Alvin remained silent as they dismantled the structure. The sound of the parts being removed echoed like a silent countdown. One by one, the screws were removed. Each gesture was slow, cautious, as if the team itself was torn between curiosity and fear of exposing a mistake that could cost their reputations. At the back of the room, two supervisors watched the scene without moving. One of them muttered, "If this doesn't work, the press will eat NASA alive." A billion-dollar project in the hands of a retired veteran. The other replied coldly, "But what if he's right? What do we do with the report on 3 years of testing?" Alvin didn't hear the conversation, but he felt the weight of it on his shoulders. He'd lived with this atmosphere of doubt, disguised as professionalism, for too long. He knew the smell of omission well. It was like old grease, It stuck to the sole and was difficult to remove. The part was finally removed. A small, seemingly harmless pin. To everyone's eyes, it was securely in place. But when the inspection light was aimed precisely, something revealed itself. It wasn't a defect, it was a subtle displacement, 0.4 of a millimeter. To the naked eye, imperceptible. But to Alvin, that detail was a scar, one he recognized like someone rediscovering their own face in a mirror after years of running away from it. The engineer in charge of the department shook his head. That can't be causing the noise. It's within the tolerance range. Alvin approached slowly, as if his boots were dragging decades of silence with them. He said firmly, "The range may be acceptable for the machine, but not for the mission." There was a brief silence, and for the first time no one dared laugh. Adjusting the pin wasn't difficult. The hard part was admitting that maybe, just maybe, the sensors had missed something that only human hearing could still detect. A detail, a metallic whisper that the algorithms couldn't fit. The part was replaced, readjusted, sealed. The engine restarted. This time no one said anything, not the most skeptical, not the youngest. They just watched, or rather, listened. The sound came through cleanly, precisely, as if the ship's heart had finally found its own rhythm. The vibrations that had previously oscillated uncomfortably were now stable. The graph on the screen seemed to breathe. For the first time in days, the sensors weren't flashing in alarm. And most impressively, the engine lasted 3 full cycles without a drop in performance. No one applauded, not for lack of desire, but because something stronger hung in the air, a kind of collective embarrassment. Alvin had done the impossible, but what was most impressive was how he reacted. There was no euphoria in his eyes, no pride. There was relief, a quiet, almost painful relief. As if, by restoring that engine, he had unearthed parts of himself that had been stifled for decades. The director, overcome with emotion, approached him. He extended his hand, but Alvin hesitated. Instead of returning it, he pointed to the workbench where his old metal box still sat. "This is what they took me out of the Navy with," he said, opening the lid with his calloused fingertips. Inside was the damaged piece of the USS Fairmont. "And this is what I'm returning with, but not to prove anything to anyone, just to finish the mission they left me to carry alone." In that moment, everyone understood. It wasn't about technology, or who was right. It was about responsibility, about the weight of carrying a flaw that wasn't yours, and still trying to fix the world as if it were. Alvin turned and walked to the hangar wall, where an old American flag hung. He stared at it for several long seconds. No one moved. It was as if everyone was waiting for him to say something. But he didn't. He just rested his hand on the fabric and closed his eyes. It's strange to think how a technical error can shape an entire life, how a decision made in a few seconds can send someone into exile. Alvin was convicted for relying too heavily on his own wiretaps, for not having digital evidence, for being analog in a world that was beginning to reject anything that couldn't fit into spreadsheets. And yet, there he was, correcting what technology couldn't predict. But fate wasn't finished with him, because something even greater awaited him, something he never asked for, but which time, with its slow and precise justice, was silently preparing. Write it down. Those who listen to the world understand what others ignore. The next morning, even before the sun lit the corridors of Kennedy Space Center, an unusual commotion began to gather behind the scenes of the program. It wasn't common to see so many serious faces gathered so early in the morning around a control room. But that day, something different hung in the air, not only the success of the test, but the buzz of a story that was beginning to spread. A man who had been forgotten, almost erased from history, had solved with a stethoscope and memory what the most modern systems could not. It was more than technical, it was symbolic. Alvin, however, wasn't at the center of it. He wasn't interested in recognition. He didn't even know his name had been reinstated in the agency's official records by direct order of the director, who had decided to correct, albeit belatedly, an injustice that had been lingering behind the scenes for years. He was outside, sitting on a low concrete wall, the sun beating silently down on his grease-stained hands. He held a mug of black coffee and gazed at the hangars as if observing a time that no longer belonged to him. He still didn't feel part of it. And perhaps he didn't even want to. Just then, a young engineer approached, shy, holding a clipboard to her chest, her eyes flickering between curiosity and admiration. "Mr. Cole?" she asked. Alvin looked up slowly. She took a deep breath before continuing. "My father served in the same fleet as you. He always talked about a technician who reported a strange noise in the engine, and no one listened." Alvin blinked, swallowed hard. "He never knew your name, but he always said the true hero of that ship was silenced." The young woman then extended her hand. "It's an honor to shake your hand, and thank you for listening." That sentence, so simple, nearly shattered everything Alvin had been holding on to. All along he thought he'd been erased, that his voice had died right there in the process. But no, it had echoed, clandestinely, silently. It had arrived where it needed to be. And in that instant, something inside him began to reassemble, like an ancient mechanism turning over again. The director then called him into a meeting that Alvin thought was just a technical wrap-up, but upon entering the room, he realized there were more people than he expected. Project leaders, veterans, agency representatives, people he hadn't seen since his Navy days. There was something more there. The director cleared his throat, visibly moved, and said, "Alvin Cole. When this center was founded, it was built on 3 pillars: innovation, precision, and courage. And you, even though you've been left out for so long, represent all 3. Yesterday you didn't just save a test. You reminded us that listening is more than processing signals. It's interpreting silences, correcting course, honoring memories." Alvin, unsure of how to react, just stood there. The room was completely silent. It was then that one of the veteran engineers walked up to him with an envelope. Inside was the official document of symbolic reinstatement, NASA's way of formally acknowledging that his dismissal years ago was based on an unjust decision. It wouldn't give back the lost years, nor would it heal all the wounds. But it was a gesture, a compromise, an apology made on letterhead, but loaded with meaning. Alvin stared at the envelope for a few seconds, as if weighing the weight not of the paper but of the story. Then he slowly folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, next to his old notebook. He looked at everyone and said, without changing his tone, "You didn't have to, but I appreciate you finally listening." The most impressive thing happened the next day. Unbeknownst to him, the records of the USS Fairmont incident were reviewed by a civilian military historian who discreetly monitored the program's behind-the-scenes operations. While sifting through forgotten internal documents, he found an unfiled memo indicating that Alvin had indeed warned about the misalignment days before the accident. The document, signed by a sergeant, had been shelved by superiors to protect a chain of command already in crisis. This hidden truth had been buried for years, until recent events made it impossible to ignore any longer. The discovery caused a stir within the Navy itself. Within hours, the base that housed the former USS Fairmont was informed. A formal apology was issued, a rare occurrence. And Alvin was invited as an honored guest to the launch of the rocket he had helped save. Not as a spectator, but as part of the crew. When he stepped onto the observation deck, wearing his blue uniform with his NASA badge pinned to his chest, the same uniform he'd kept for decades in a plastic bag at the back of his closet, those below looked up. Some stood, others saluted, and Alvin, for the first time in years, felt like he was no longer a visitor. He was part of it all. But he didn't get emotional in front of everyone. Only later, when he was alone in the shadow of the structure, his back to the rocket, did he let the tear fall. It wasn't pride, it was release. A knot that slowly unraveled within a chest that had endured too much silence for too long. The mission was complete, but Alvin didn't go straight home. He drove to the harbor where the USS Fairmont had last docked. He stood there for hours, staring out at the sea, stethoscope in hand. As if he could still hear the engine he'd once tried to save, and as if finally he was ready to let that sound go. Write in the comments, "I also carry things that no one sees." He climbed the 3 steps to the platform with slow but steady steps, as if carrying not just his own body, but an entire life on his shoulders. His NASA uniform, hastily adjusted over the worn shirt he insisted on wearing underneath, seemed to contradict who he was inside and out. A simple man, his hands marked by the rust of years, but who had just marked, with a silent gesture, one of the most symbolic moments in the agency's recent history. Alvin looked around. Up ahead, the rocket stood like a monument to the future. Around it, journalists, engineers, officers, and veterans stood in respectful silence. But his eyes searched for something beyond the metallic structure. They searched for faces, faces from the past. And then, among those present, he saw the unexpected. Sitting in the right row was the commander who, decades earlier, had judged him at the military council. He was older, white-haired, but with the same rigid chin of someone who had learned to give orders without hesitation. Alvin recognized him immediately, but even more impressive was the man's gesture. He stood up. Amidst the crowd, he was the first to clap. Once, twice, 3 times, and the others followed. It was almost surreal. Alvin, who had left the Navy with a tarnished reputation, was now being applauded by the same institution that had condemned him. But even then, he didn't let himself get carried away. Because behind every clap, he could still hear the sound of what wasn't said when he needed it most. The silence still echoed within him when he tried to explain, and was cut off. When he asked for a second chance, and was laughed at, when he swore he'd heard what no one heard and was called crazy. But now, in that moment suspended in time, that sound began to be replaced by another. Something he had almost forgotten what it felt like: recognition. The mission director took the microphone and, breaking protocol, said, "Today we're not just launching a vehicle. Today we're launching a symbol of listening, of justice, of courage." This engine, which will soon be ignited in front of everyone, had its trajectory changed by a man who doesn't appear in books. A man who lived long enough to see what almost no one else saw, and who heard what no machine would hear. A deep silence filled the space. Alvin lowered his head, but not to hide his tears. It was as if he was saluting everything he'd had to swallow for years. And what he swallowed was a lot. He swallowed humiliation when he received the letter of dismissal without the right of reply. He swallowed anger when he saw his colleagues withdraw for fear of being associated with him. He swallowed resentment when the Navy revoked his access to bases and closed the doors he himself helped build. But in that moment, what he received in return wasn't just applause. It was a response, as if each clap echoed, "We made a mistake, but you stayed." From the platform, he watched as the countdown approached. The director invited him to activate, with the simple touch of a button, the first stage of ignition, a symbolic gesture. Alvin hesitated. His hand trembled for a moment, but not from fear. It was the weight of memory. This wasn't just a button, it was the end of one cycle, and also the beginning of another. He squeezed. The sound that came from the base of the rocket was powerful, but not thunderous. It was controlled, precise, exact. As if the universe itself had decided to follow the rhythm Alvin had taught it. The rocket wouldn't take off at that moment. It was just a final rehearsal. But everything worked perfectly. The sensors rose, the vibration was steady, and everyone's heart was racing. But Alvin's at that moment was calm. While everyone celebrated, he walked away silently. He descended the platform and walked to a secluded spot, where the wind blew without asking permission. There alone, he took something from his pocket that no one had seen there. A small yellowed envelope with the Navy seal in the corner. It was the original notice of his departure. He had never opened it. He had never had the courage. He carried that piece of paper like someone carrying raw pain, without touching it, but without letting go. He opened it. He read it slowly. It was dry, cold. "Based on the technical reports, we consider the permanent removal of propulsion engineer Alvin James Cole without the right to review." Nothing more. No human signature. No emotional justification. A document meant to be closed, not understood. Alvin calmly folded the paper. Then he tore it, not out of anger, but because, finally, I didn't need him anymore. What kept him going wasn't that pain anymore. It was everything he'd built even with it. Before leaving the Space Center, someone approached with a small box. They said they'd found it among the old files, deep in the naval base's storage room. It was his. Inside was a medallion, one that should have been given to him in the 1980s, but never shipped. A medal of merit in precision engineering. Never delivered, never recognized. Until now. Alvin looked at the object and smiled. It wasn't for honor. It was for time. Time is the only thing that listens to what no one else has heard. And one day, it answers. He put the medal in his pocket and for the first time in a long time didn't look back. Write in the comments. It took a while, but it arrived. If you've stuck around this far, perhaps this story touched you in a special way. And honestly, I think it needed to be told this way, with time, with silence, with listening, because some things can't be proven with graphs, but with history, with memory. If this content made sense to you, if it made you think of someone who also carried a lot in silence, leave a comment below with the phrase, "I listened to the end," just so I know you've been with me this far, in this very intimate moment of this journey. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're creating a space for stories like this, real or fictional, but always filled with soul. And if this video touched you, please leave a like. Not because you have to, but because it might have created a connection within you. And that's really important. And if you want to continue feeling this way, there's a video here that complements this reflection. Click and follow me. The next story also has a lot to say, even in the silence.